This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. A cattle market update with Ever.Ag's Livestock Division Chief Economist Lee Schulz starts the show for today. Lee talks about the current market outlook, beef export statistics, and buying versus raising beef cow replacement heifers. The show continues with K-State's Sarah Sexton-Bowser and Andres Patrignani as the pair discusses a recent research publication that looks into the potential of rain-fed grain sorghum in Kansas. Joe Gerken, K-State Fisheries and Aquatics Extension Specialist, finishes out the show as he explains what birds people could be seeing right now and the changes those birds are going through. That and more is coming up ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Monday show with a cattle market update with Chief Economist for Ever.Ag's Livestock Division, Lee Schulz. Lee, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, and some of our listeners will maybe note the change in my title. I just wanted to highlight that. That's a bit of a personal and professional change for our family. We're relocating to Minnesota, and so I'll be forever grateful for the opportunity at Iowa State University, but looking forward to the new opportunity with Ever.Ag.
And Lee, we're excited to still have you joining us here for a little while. And as we talk about the cattle market, what are we seeing for futures?
This last week, I would argue was a steady to upward movement in the markets. You have to look at both futures as well as the cash market. Futures were up anywhere from the near-term October contract of over $1 for the week to less than that for as you get out more deferred contracts. I think that follows similar to what we've seen in the cash trade. Cash overall was up about $1 if you look at the Southern Plains as well as the Western Corn Belt. And I think really what's driving this market is you're seeing a tightening of supplies available. And we're really, when you look at last week's slaughter, was below 600,000. You were looking at through Friday, 580,000, through Saturday, only 586. And so that brought us over 4% below what we had seen when you compare to a year ago or even the previous week. So significantly tightening of those slaughter supplies. I think part of it is you continue to see cattle producers hold cattle, and that's kind of indicative of those higher weights we're seeing for cattle, and that's tightened up the supplies. Now, from a packer standpoint, we've seen that work to really strengthen box beef prices. So over this last week, you've seen box beef prices over $8 increase. You went from an average of from September 30th to October 4th, average about $300 per hundredweight for choice box beef, up to over $308 this ending last week. So and Friday was up $311 per hundredweight. So very strong box beef prices. Part of that's a demand pull as you think about we're getting into that seasonally stronger pricing as we get into the holidays. So demand pull is certainly as well as supply push helped with those tighter slaughter supplies.
And looking at demand past just the United States, what are we seeing for exports?
So this last week, we got our latest official export data. This is provided by USDA. I'll give credit to U.S. Meat Export Federation. They do a great job of compiling the data. It's very detailed data, and then also providing a press release that kind of talks through why we've seen some of the changes and the changes that we did see. When we look at the headline numbers, beef exports by volume were down 6%. When you look at August data, this is the lowest since January. Value fell 4%. But as you look through the first 8 months of the year, beef exports were only 3% below a year ago and actually up 4% by value. So as we've exported less, higher dollars amounts, higher value have offset some of that reduced volume standpoint. Another couple numbers that I like to look at in this report is the beef value, what that equates to when you look at a fed slaughter animal, so steer or heifer. We've seen that this last month of August, which is most recent available, was $391.19 per head. And when we're thinking about $2,800 animals, right? That's a significant contribution that exports are playing when we think about the value to a fed steer. Now, as we think about going into the next couple of months, will be certainly critical as you think about tighter supplies of beef being available, but exports are still providing relative strength when we think about demand. Also, I encourage our listeners to keep in mind, we are expected to see lower export volumes going forward because we're seeing tighter beef production. That's expected over the next couple of years. But what also is forecasted is the percent exported as a percent of our production is expected to remain relatively constant. So I think it's important to keep in mind that, we'll likely export less, but still the same amount of our production will be exported.
And what are for some of those reasons we're expecting to see tighter beef production?
Well, the expansion is around the corner, right? And that's really the question, or how far around the corner, right? And that's why I hesitated a little bit, because so far we haven't seen much reduction in total production, right? As we've continued to put more heifers on feed, we've pulled some feeder cattle ahead, we've marketed more beef cows, right? And all that has mitigated any real large drop in beef production, right? So that's allowed us to sustain levels of available supplies, be either domestically or on the export market. But eventually we're going to turn the corner here because there's a lot of incentive to start expanding as we look at high calf values. And when we start to do that, we'll really start to see all of the beef supplies really starting to tighten up.
And for producers who are maybe thinking about rounding that corner when it comes to expansion, you recently wrote an article titled Raising versus Buying Heifers for Beef Cow Replacement. And can you share with us some things that people should probably think through?
So we wrote a fact sheet and to build some decision tools back in 2013-14, the last time we were talking about expansion in the beef cattle herd. And these resources are real timely again, because again, we're starting to talk about expansion. We haven't really realized an expansion here in 2024, but 2025, we could really start to see that happen. But when you think about cow-calf producers, when they make that decision to expand, it's really several years before they start to realize that expansion in the form of increased numbers of calves available to sell, right? So if you think about this fall, cow-calf producer may have the option to market a heifer calf, right, to historically high calf prices, right? And that's contributing to these higher revenue values and higher profits for cow-calf producers. Alternatively, they could choose to retain that heifer, breed her this coming summer, and then calve out that heifer the following spring in 2026. And that could be a form of replacing cull cows or starting to expand their herd. So the tools that we've developed looks at a decision of maybe I typically raise my own replacement heifers, but should I look at opportunities to market those calves this fall and buy a replacement heifer back in the spring of 2026? And so it's really looking at that decision a producer should make and what increases net income for a producer.
What are some advantages you might see for raising or buying?
Well, there's advantages and disadvantages to both, right? Anytime there's a decision, it's obviously not usually an easy decision. It's going to really come down to individual producers. But you may think producers may be able to raise replacement heifers at lower cost than buy them, right? So if that's my comparative advantage, I may be better off raising them than going out to buy them. Now, you may already have desirable genetics and you want to maintain genetic control. By raising my own, it's a lot of times easier to do that. You also avoid maybe some environmental stresses by bringing in heifers external from the herd. And you don't have to worry about open market availability and prices in 2026 in the example that I gave you. Now, there's also some potentials to buying heifers because here you can preserve a lot of those resources you would spend raising your own heifers to do something else. And it may be backgrounding cattle. It may be expanding the cow herd faster. And so you're going to devote those resources to something else. And you may value reduced bull needs. So you could buy bred heifers instead of, having to rely on more bulls on your individual operation. And you can maybe access genetically superior heifers and facilitate faster herd growth.
For people who are interested in using these tools and need some maybe help making these decisions, how can they find them?
So they are available on Ag Decision Maker website. It's an Iowa State University Extension and Outreach website. And I think to kind of maybe drive home the point, I think the most important thing with these tools is they really help you think through and identify how results are impacted by individual parameters, right? So the price of heifer calves, interest rates, prices of purchased bred heifers, feed costs, all of those are going to have a different impact on the results. So you can look at how sensitive individual inputs on your operation are and how that impacts the decision that you may want to make.
Anything you might encourage producers just to go take a quick look at?
Well, one thing that hit the newswire this last week was USDA had a press release that was titled, USDA announces actions to lower food prices, bring fairness to farmers, and promote more competitive food supply chain. And this has been from the current administration. And I would encourage our listeners to go check this information out. There's two components of three that are really focused on the beef cattle industry. One is access to a retail report. So USDA has what they termed as an interim report. It uses the beef market as a case study that tries to better understand access to retail dynamics for producers and consumers. They call it an interim study because there's more work to be done, and stakeholders within the industry can provide input. The other one is a cattle price discovery advance notice of proposed rulemaking. And so here, USDA is seeking comment on a range of targeted options to improve price discovery and fair and competitive trading in fed cattle markets. So again, that's very important for producers, and I would encourage them to go make that comment to USDA as they go through some of this rulemaking process.
That was Chief Economist for Ever.Ag's Livestock Division, Lee Schulz. I will link the resources that he mentioned in today's show notes on agtoday.net. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but we'll be right back. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our show talking about a recent research publication titled Yield Gap Analysis for Rainfed Grain Sorghum in Kansas with Managing Director for the Center of Sorghum Improvement, Sarah Sexton-Bowser, and Associate Professor in the Department of Agronomy, Andres Patrignani. Andres, Sarah, thank you both so much for taking the time to join us today.
Thank you for having us.
Glad to be here to talk about sorghum.
Sarah, can you tell us a little bit about where has sorghum been in Kansas and where it currently is?
Well, if any Kansan is out there driving across the state, you start to really develop an affinity for the crop this time of year as you see those pretty fields turn to red, and you start to see the crop quite a bit across the state with a greater concentration of the crop in the western part of Kansas. Kansas is a really important state to the crop as we grow nearly 50% of the entire U.S. production. We also represent a really strong gradient of sorghum production area with greater rainfall in the east to stronger water limitation in the west. And so as a model to think about sorghum and the crop, Kansas provides a really nice test bed to think about the key questions of the crop, as well as because we do grow so much, we are true stakeholders and vested in the crop. And so that leads us to think about here at K-State with the Center for Sorghum Improvement, if sorghum, as we know, is an important crop to the state, what are the key investments? What are the key considerations that need to be undertook to advance the crop and really make sure that sorghum is an important crop today, but also tomorrow? And what are those gaps in technology and advancement that will really move the needle to ensure a positive future for the crop?
What is yield gap analysis?
It's a way of quantifying, how far current yields are from the maximum that we can achieve in a given environment. I think much of the pioneering work for the yield gap analysis stems from research at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. So why is that some crops like corn and soybeans where, we're having stagnant yields? And one way to find out what are the reasons for that is to see whether you are very close to the maximum that you can already produce. If you are very close to the maximum, if you are really close to the ceiling, then maybe there is no more room for improvement. And so, but in some cases, like in our study, we found that we were pretty far from the maximum. And so that means that there might be other causes, limiting the yield that we can produce.
And what were some of those limitations you saw, Sarah?
Yeah, I really like yield gap because it helps us understand this tension between expanding opportunity in a crop and where we are in a crop. And so, as Andres was sharing there, there's the water limited potential, and that's really, are we seeing gains in the genetics of the crop? Are we seeing improvement in the potential exploitable yield that a farmer can chase after? And then we have current yield, and that's really, what's the management, the adoption of crop technologies? What are farmers able to achieve today, currently? And then, what are they doing from a landscape and management and adoption of that crop in their system to get closer to those exploitable yields? And so as we looked at that, we thought maybe, as we've seen recent trends in the state of Kansas indicate that we've had a leveling out of those yield increases. If you go back in time, pre-hybrids in sorghum, we had, just steady planting of the crop. Then we have hybridization, where you have a major jump in the crop and crop gains and overall yields. Then we have the slow march where you have the green bug and we have a little bit of wrestling, but still see really positive genetic gain in the crop. And as of recent, we've started to see a leveling out. And so that's really was the impetus of this research question. And so as Andres was indicating, maybe there's just not a lot of yield left on the table for us. Is that something we need to address? And so as we stepped back and looked at the available data sources, we took data from USDA, National Agriculture Statistics. We took data from the great work that K-State does, as well as National Sorghum Producers does a yield contest. And in looking at those yields, we're able to identify what's the typical precipitation and what's the yield realized at that typical precipitation. And so as we looked at that, we found that, in fact, sorghum has not yet hit that pinch point. 70% is typically across the literature is where we start to see that pinch point of if current yields are 70% of your yield potential. That's where you start to see that stagnation. And sorghum, from a yield potential, water limited yield potential, sorghum is 49%. So we still have an opportunity to continue to improve yields within the sorghum crop. And there's still, continued gap for farmers to raise their current yields relative to water limited potential. So that really led us to say, well, what are some of those other factors within the crop system that may be leading to some of the stagnation that we've seen in recent years?
So what are some of those limitations?
Kansas is a great test bed because we have a water-rich eastern Kansas and a water-limited western Kansas. And we've seen a couple different things occur, and farmers, I think, would be the first to be able to share this with you. Sorghum is often considered as a workhorse of your crop rotation. And we've seen some shifts in where sorghum is planted and how it's planted. First, I think in a positive thing our research was able to identify is sorghum has increased in planting by 20% in the western part of Kansas. And the primary driver of when we see increases of sorghum in the crop rotation, it's transitioning from that traditional wheat fallow, summer fallow crop rotation to a wheat sorghum summer fallow crop rotation. So what's that do? That takes a 15-month summer fallow period that would have seen 2 4th of Julys and reduces that to an 11-month fallow period that only sees 1 4th of July. And when we think about how can we build biomass, how can we have sustainable crops and crop productivity under water limitation, that's exciting to see that these mix of other rotation practices, certainly no-till is a part of that. Some of this is earlier maturity sorghums. This mix of practices has allowed us to intensify under water limitation, and we're continuing to see stable productivity under those conditions. So that's one item. We also found another element of looking at the placement of sorghum on land quality. NRCS has a land rating that ranges from 1 of like the most primo croplands to 8, which is pretty tough land, and really 1 to 4 is your range of farmlands. And we see that sorghum has an average state rating of 2.5 across the state, and that is reduced relative to other crops. It's about 20% higher than other crops in the state. And what that indicates is that farmers, when they look at their crop mix and they think about the lands that they have to allocate to crops, they often place sorghum in some pretty tough landscapes because of its stable yield opportunity under stress. And so when we think about sorghum yield gap and trends in sorghum, certainly we have seen stagnation, but we've also seen the crop continue to open opportunities for production agriculture under some pretty tough environments. And, just like our Kansas farmers are pretty tough and hardy, sorghum as a crop matches some of that hardiness as well.
What do you really want growers to get from this research that you've done?
First, I think fundamentally to this research is really an understanding that if you're going to make an investment in a crop, you need to understand where you are today. And so we have, with this work, a really nice canvas to say, here's where the crop is, here's where the gap is. Let's think about what we can do going forward. And some of the recommendations we have, they're twofold, and they represent some diverging trends that we identified in this paper. The first one is farmers are starting to use this crop really to intensify in pretty water-limited environments, really just helping farmers when they have water limitation, they're moving sorghum in, helping them understand what is their degree of reliability that they can intensify given their conditions and where are those windows where that makes the most sense. On the other side, we did identify that while we still haven't reached that 70%, in eastern Kansas, we do have a narrower exploitable yield, indicating that we have seen a much more concentrated improvement of yield opportunity in water limitation, but under moderate water limitation of eastern Kansas, we haven't seen the magnitude of exploitable yield increases. And so we recommend that sorghum as a crop work to concentrate on areas with moderate water limitation to increase yields in those areas. We recognize it's a small crop, so we strongly encourage combinations of public-private partnerships to really advance and narrow in on those selection targets in those environments. That way we can have an industry for sorghum that has a strong footing across the entire state of Kansas as well as in other regions.
If people are wanting to take an in-depth look at this research paper, how can they do that?
Well, the research will be published in Agronomy Journal. One of the cool things that I want to point out about this study is that for any research that we do, we need data. And something that Sarah did here with the yield gap analysis is she was able to pull multiple sources of data that we are lucky to have, thanks to federal agencies and Kansas State University. So she pulled crop performance trials conducted by the Department of Agronomy. She conducted, pool yield contest. And then we use county-level data from the Department of Agriculture. So this technique of the yield gap analysis allows you to integrate lots of observations. So sometimes you can also use models, but one of the beauties of these studies are all based on observed data, including some of the weather data, from the Kansas Mesonet that we have, across the entire state. So
that was Associate Professor in the Department of Agronomy, Andres Patrignani, joined by Managing Director for the Center of Sorghum Improvement, Sarah Sexton-Bowser. I will link this research publication in today's show notes on agtoday.net. We're cutting to a short break now, but stick around because we have more for you up ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we round out our Monday show talking about birds and fall migration with K-State Fisheries and Aquatics Extension Specialist Joe Gerken. Joe, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me back.
Joe, what could we be seeing with birds and fall migration this time of year?
Yeah, this is a really good time of year to see a bunch of birds. So there's a lot of birds that are deciding to move south, and so they're going to be passing through Kansas, and that'll give us an opportunity to see a lot of birds that we might not be able to see in other times of the year. So Kansas has somewhere between 450 and 500 birds that frequent the state. And so quite a few birds. That actually makes us the 16th state in the nation for the most richness. So we're up there, lots of opportunities to get out and see birds. Fall migration, like I said, there's a lot of birds passing through. It's just a good time to get out and be around some water and see some different types of birds that might be there.
What different types of birds could people be seeing?
Sure. So a lot of people know about ducks, right? And so the big green-headed ducks are called mallards. And so mallards start to show up in pretty big numbers. There are some mallards that stick around all year, but you'll start seeing more of those. We've already seen blue-wing and green-wing teal start to move through. So they start their migration a little bit earlier. They have a little bit smaller body size, and so they may be moving through a little bit earlier, and they might start moving out, in the next month or so, assuming we get some colder temperatures. So lots of different types of ducks, gadwalls, pintails, just really a lot of diversity with ducks. It's a great time to look for cranes. And so one of the really cool things that happens this time of year, late October into early November, is that sandhill cranes move through. And a lot of times there'll be a few whooping cranes with those flocks as well. So a good opportunity to get out and see, those are birds that you can't really see in high numbers a lot of times in Kansas. So good opportunity to get out and see some birds that you may not see in other times of the year.
Do they go through other changes this time of year?
Yeah, and so one of the biggest changes that you'll see is changes in their plumage. And so a lot of these birds are brightly colored or have really bright feathers when they're in their breeding plumage. And so when they're up north and they're mating throughout their life cycle in the spring and early summer, they'll have really bright coloration. But as they move into the fall time frame, a lot of those bright colors go away and they tend to be more drab, some more browns, more blacks, just kind of more overall colors. But that's important to keep in mind when you're out birding and looking at different birds, to make sure that you're looking for the right plumage and you can identify the different birds that you're seeing.
Are there places in Kansas they like to stop by quite often?
You'll see birds at your backyard pond. You can see them at reservoirs, but there's two places that I definitely want to highlight. One of those is the Quivira National Wildlife Refuge, and that's a federal refuge that's managed by federal agencies, but just lots of water and lots of area that these birds can stop by. A really important stopping point for a lot of these birds as they make their migration south. Another really popular and really important place is Cheyenne Bottoms, and that's owned and operated by the state of Kansas. So both of these places have lots of opportunities to see lots of different birds, lots of different habitats where you can see a big diversity. And also they have really good loops and driving areas where you can get in and get access to sites where you can see a lot of these really cool birds that are passing through.
How long does fall migration usually take?
Yeah, that depends on the species. And so some species move pretty quickly. They'll get from north to south in a month or so. Some take longer. Some kind of hang out and stop. They might come to Kansas and decide that, hey, the weather here is pretty nice, and stick around until we get to, December or January and we get a really cold spell, and then they might go further south. So kind of depends on the species. And even within the species, some individuals will decide to stick around longer than others. And so we'll see kind of this trickle effect for, a couple months, but the real peak is probably that late October, early November time frame when you get, kind of the most diversity passing through our area.
For people who are really interested in birds and want to see some fall migration, is there a landscape or spot that maybe is the best?
Well, best is definitely subjective. And so, making sure you target which species you want to see. Obviously, I like aquatics, so I'd say get out near some water where you can see a lot of diversity. You can see ducks, wading birds, shore birds. And then also in a lot of the transition habitats, there'll be a lot of birds that are more terrestrial that may go into those areas to feed. So stick around water. But, a lot of these refuges that we talked about have a big diversity of habitats. And so a lot of different opportunities to see a lot of different birds.
That was K-State Fisheries and Aquatics Extension Specialist Joe Gerken. That's all we have for you today on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more for you tomorrow.